The following video is a condensed clip from Thought Lab, one of the 4 Philosophy Portal live event spaces. To watch the whole video, or to attend and participate in future events, visit philosophyportal.online and become a member today. We're in the cloud. Welcome to the second Thought Lab. Thought Lab, first and foremost, I'd say is a place designed to institute a type of informal thought leadership in some sense. It's kind of like a professorship. Thought Lab is different and distinct from the other events in the sense that I specifically try to invite someone who's been mediating a concept long term, someone who's been working with and thinking with a concept for a long period of time. It's sort of become well defined. It's become a central part of their work. It's presumably been worked through in a long form book or something like that. And I invited David McKerracher for this month, not only because sort of the theme is communism, and I know sort of joking around, it's not, here we're identifying with anything like 20th century communism, but it's more thinking through, let's say, the way I would think about it is thinking through the symptom of communitarianism and also the symptom of the failures of neoliberal capitalism. And the only other sort of dominant paradigm that's ever really competed or can be contrasted with capitalism in that way is communism. And really, Philosophy Portal is a space where we're trying to think through these concepts and beyond these concepts. And Dave here with the concept of time energy, I felt like it was a great fit because, in his work, Dave's actively wrestling with, although he's not sort of engaging in that sort of dualism of capitalism, communism, he's actively wrestling with questions of political economy. And he's actively wrestling with the struggles of neoliberal capitalism and how to adapt, adjust, and thrive in our current political economic climate. And I feel like time energy has been a really useful and interesting concept to think with for myself. I wrote a blog this week. I just realized how useful, I've recognized the utility of the concept before, but just writing a blog post this week, it really sort of, I felt it in a different way, how useful this concept is and how much can be played, how much you can play with it. And I'm excited to continue doing that. So this is the second Thought Lab. I guess I'm just going to pass it over to Dave now for an introduction to the concept of time energy, and then excited to get into a larger discussion about it. But welcome, Dave, and the floor is yours.
All right. Well, first of all, I want to thank Del for having me and for engaging with the concept of time energy. As I say in the book, I am a time energy reductionist at this point, which means that, like, I really don't care how you identify. I really don't care what you believe in. Religious, political. My hunch is that nobody has everything figured out. Any broad-based structural change is going to require everybody, or at least a lot more people than the current niche kind of political identities and groupings that we see. And more importantly, that no existing organization, political program, party, or movement has a monopoly on not just truth, but more importantly, a sort of solution to what I take to be the central problem of the 21st century. And the 21st century problem is really a problem that's been with us all throughout capitalism. But really, if you were in previous societies, this problem would have probably manifested in, there would be similarities with how this problem manifested there as opposed to here, but there would also be differences. So time energy is the issue this is the issue that I want to focus on. So what is it? And I'm going to just start out by saying the short definition. Then I'm going to go through some basic questions or points that I want you all to have in mind so that you're able to use the concept yourselves. Most of the time I kind of am like, you should probably read the book if you want to use the concept. But the fact is most people don't. People don't have the time energy to read the time energy book. And, so it's a little ironic, but that's also just the situation that we're in. And that's why people do refer to this term, but it is a technical concept, and a technical philosophical concept means that it has an aim. It hopefully has a method. We have to talk about the background, purpose, and method of time energy as a concept, and get into this a little technically. So I'll just start off by saying it's not just time and energy mashed together, right? It is large energy infused repeatable blocks of time reliably throughout your week. Critics of capitalism, like Theodore Adorno, understood that there was a crisis in terms of people's time. He understood that he had a kind of privilege when it came to time because he was able to focus on doing the things that he loved in the space of leisure, right? And he says this leisure is not the same thing as free time. Very important distinction for me in my development, thinking about these things. But what I was noticing throughout, I would say, the last 10 years was that it's never just time. No working class person ever says they just don't have the time. I mean, well, maybe they do, but almost always the one thing that everyone is saying is, I don't have the time or energy, right? Or if I have the time or energy, or if I have the time and energy, right? Because it's not enough to have energy or time. You actually have to have them both, right? So that's the sort of the common sense level. Putting those two terms together, it is commonsensical. People think, well, yeah, I don't have the time and energy. Oh, I don't have the time energy. So it's supposed to be intuitive and commonsensical, but it's also supposed to take you beyond that intuitive level. It's supposed to get into the actual structure of your week, of the month, and of the society itself that makes it so that you never have large energy infused repeatable blocks of time that are reliably throughout the week. And so this comes from my experiences just being a working person myself. This comes from the experience of going from being a regular entry-level kind of worker for almost a decade to then going into college, and then also not really having my time energy, but realizing that it was different. Like the way in which I didn't have my time energy at college was different than the way in which I didn't have my time energy in the regular workforce. And that was interesting to me. And I don't think I would have started thinking about it so early in my philosophical career if it wasn't for the fact that the first time I really found out about philosophy was accidental in a sort of sense. The word philosophy did not mean anything to me. I was 23 years old. I didn't know who Socrates was. I am a product of a broken, education system like everyone else in the United States, but maybe worse so because my parents tried to homeschool me. And I say tried in that, they at least didn't put me into the schooling system, but they also didn't really give me structure, accountability. There was nobody in the family who was like loved ideas, right? There was nobody who was passionate about subject matters. And of course, even if my mom was like a polymath, she would have been strapped for time. She had things to focus on. My dad would be gone from the house from before sunup to after sundown. And so here I was, 23 years old. I did not know who Socrates was. So I'm not trying to blame my parents for that. I think that this is actually true for a lot of people who come out of like the public school, system. Maybe they can't tell the difference between Socrates and Sophocles, right? Like that to them, it's just old Greek guys. They're dead. Who cares? Well, in the first semester at college, I found out about elective courses. One of the academic advisors was there in the computer lab when I was registering for courses. And I was like, well, what do I have to do? And they were like, well, you should add a couple of like fun classes for this first semester just to kind of make it bearable because you're going to be doing all this remedial math and you're going to be doing all of this like basic English stuff and all of these things. And I was like, okay. And so, I was like, well, I'm interested in politics, and at this point I would have probably classified myself as some kind of maybe I would have called myself some kind of a socialist. I don't think I would have used the word, right? But I was into the Venus Project, which, I don't know if anybody's ever seen that on YouTube, but it's a visionary way of thinking about the society where everything's sustainable and everybody works together or whatever, which is very basically socialist. And so I was like, I think that's a cool idea. It sure beats the Democrats and Republicans approach to things that has no future, right? No theory, no Mark Fisher, no philosophy. I still knew nothing on the table had any real future to it. None of the stuff on the table was taking seriously the technological means at our disposal, right? And so I ended up enlisting in a course called political philosophy. It was an advanced course that I actually had to get permission for since I didn't have the prerequisites. And it was taught by a very conservative professor. I didn't realize he was conservative at the time, or I might not have taken the class because I had my prejudices. but he was very good at teaching every thinker in the most fair way possible. So we spent like 2 weeks on Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and like Rousseau was the man. I was so excited when we finally got to Rousseau because we had already been through Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, Machiavelli's The Prince. And so by the time we get to Rousseau, after John Locke's second treatise on government, by the way, I had liked John Locke because I liked the labor theory of value, right? And I think that basically comes from John Locke. I mean, it really gets articulated for modernity by John Locke first before it gets taken up by, Adam Smith and Ricardo and John Stuart Mill. So not saying that I'm an expert on any of those guys. Like, we barely even got into Adam Smith. We did spend like at least a week on him. But why am I saying all of this? I'm giving a little background here on the concept and on myself, and that is to say that if it wasn't for that first semester and taking a political philosophy class, I wouldn't have looked into Marx, and I wouldn't have looked into Marx if he hadn't been treated so unjustly by this professor. So yeah, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he's a socialist. We spent weeks on Jean-Jacques Rousseau. We spent 1 day on Karl Marx. And I remember just being like, this is strange because like, this is a course where you can't get by without really doing the reading. Like, he asks the kinds of questions on the written exams that really challenge your knowledge, and you have to have done the reading, right? Except that when it came to Marx, it was just like, it was obviously not taking him seriously as a thinker. And that's when my little alarm bell went off, and I was like, he must be a conservative, because I'd been wondering the whole class, like, what's his politics? And I was like, dude, the guy's a conservative. He's just hiding it. And then I was like, that's amazing. At this point, I kind of didn't care because I appreciated his ability to teach. That was the beginning of the opening of my mind when it comes to the fact that, oh, the university, it actually kind of has to have different people from different perspectives, like walk you through the canon so that you actually get different ways of seeing the whole history of ideas. Well, it was because he was so unjust towards Marx, though, that I ended up going and searching out professors who were into Marx so that I could find somebody to talk about him to my philosophy club. And I found this guy, Bruce Bierman from Gonzaga University, who was part-timing at North Idaho College. And that was probably the coolest series of events that we did on campus. And basically what would happen is once a month, he would come and talk about some reading by Marx. And we did this for 3 months. And it was a strange labor that was the truly transformative piece for me. The manifesto, I'd already kind of read it for the political philosophy class. And so, he was teaching it sympathetically. And that was, new to me because I hadn't heard somebody teach it sympathetically yet. Wage, Labor, and Capital, that was also a really cool reading, but it was a bit much for me. Like, I couldn't really comprehend all of these moving parts. And then, and that I was a baby. I was just starting out into political philosophy, but it was a strange labor. So, show of hands here. I know only a couple of you have your cameras on, but I'm curious how many of you have actually read that fragment from 1844 on a strange labor. Fidel has, and people will also talk about it. Oh, that's Demitri. Nice. Rosenstock. Come on, man. Well, we've got a few people here who've read it, and it has also read it. And so, yeah, this became for me, I think, the most liberating idea. The idea that under capitalism, it's not just that competition drives prices down and that the only way to make a profit in that situation is to also keep wages low while overworking people, intensifying the labor during the working week and lengthening the working day and or week. No, it goes beyond that. At a fundamental level, we spend most of our lives preoccupied with something we don't have control over and that we don't even understand. And so we are alienated from control, we are alienated from understanding, and then we're also obviously alienated from one another because we're kind of like fractured human beings, right? We're so compartmentalized and doing dumbed down stuff. And at this point, I was coming from a working background where I had been doing mundane sort of toil. This was construction, foundations, roofing, drywall, framing, like construction, right? But also stocking grocery store shelves on a graveyard shift, or working in the food service industry. And so it is really kind of like dumb toil that had defined a large portion of my life. And the people that I grew up around were not people who had gone to college. They were not people who had expertise on much except for what they would probably call street smarts, which obviously there's something to that, but it can only get you so far, right? So it was a combination of estranged labor and the rise of the working class movement post Occupy. So I'm starting to think, oh, I'm like a Marxist and I believe in like this left fusionist approach to politics. And I thought that the left was going to be like the place where people get it. What do they get? What did I assume the left would understand better than anyone else? Well, because of my limited exposure to the left, because of like having no history, because of having read Estranged Labor, I think, oh, they respect Marx, right? Marx is kind of like the father of communism, but he also inspires socialists who might not be standard communists. He's just overall like the Chad of political theory on the left. Like that's kind of how I was thinking about it. And so what I thought people would understand is this basic idea that, yeah, sure, people, they are responsible in a sort of sense, but also a politics that approaches people as though they are responsible is not the kind of politics that is going to ever address large structural issues. And obviously there is a little bit of that on the left. People talk about systemic racism, but the way they talk about that is to say, well, if you as an individual don't say or do X, Y, or Z things, then you're participating in these systems of oppression. And then, so it's basically turning the tables from, systemic and structural ways of thinking back onto the individual, which is neoliberalism, right? The individualization of all responsibility back onto you. Now, from the existential and interpersonal level, yes, we're responsible. If I'm talking to you one-on-one, we can have that conversation. But as soon as we're talking about the third person, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? We're supposed to be talking about things a little more sociologically and politically at that point. Well, I thought that was just understood on the left. I thought that people just get it, that you are not supposed to scapegoat working class parents. You're not supposed to scapegoat racial minorities. You're not supposed to scapegoat. Okay, everyone's on board with not scapegoating racial minorities, but very few people are on board with not scapegoating working class parents. In fact, with the rise of Trump, scapegoating a certain kind of working class parent became common. In fact, anti-populism became common on the left, right? Oh, populism gave us this guy Trump, therefore we should be anti-populist, right? Oh, see how stupid and reactionary populism is. And I think that, yeah, it's a dead end, sure. All you can say about populism is that it's a kind of movement energy and or it's a kind of rhetoric that is usually espoused by people who have no real future in their plan either. Well, but insofar as it is a kind of movement energy, not just a kind of rhetoric used by worldview salesmen, it comes from a genuine place of discontent based on disenfranchisement, based on alienation, right? So you would think that we'd be sympathetic to that, right? Well, for a while we were. Generally on the left, there was some sympathy to working parents, and Bernie's approach, especially in 2016, was no, we're just for the working class. The Democrats have not been. We're anti-Democrats, and he was a lot more anti-Democrats and pro-working class than he was just focused on beating Trump, right? But because everyone blamed him for Hillary's loss, the second time around, he starts blaming Trump constantly. It just became Trump, 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 Trump. That's kind of my summary of it. I did a lot of door knocking. I did a lot of phone calling. I was in a Marxist organization, and we did a lot of working with the Democratic Socialists of America, even though they're usually just radical libs, right? Because we believed at the end of the day, it matters that people become class conscious again. You cannot have anything else. We don't get to have any nice things if people don't become at least class conscious. There were problems though. And I think most of the problems came down to time energy. organizing work comes down to time energy. People do not have the time energy to reliably show up and actually do things. I have this concept called, there's a couple ways of talking about it. One way is like, we have like imagination stomachs for our time energy appetites, right? Like everyone, I think, experiences this and should be able to relate to it when thinking about the way you feel approaching New Year's. There's a handful of people who, because they know they're supposed to be goal setting or whatever, like they want to transgress that maybe, and they get some kind of like impulse to do something different than goal set. But most people do some kind of reevaluation and goal setting come New Year's. Or, and sorry, it's I don't know, it's like a neighborhood specific, or if it's just like I come from a idiot backcountry part of the world, but we literally say New Year's instead of like Happy New Year's when you're supposed to say Happy New Year. So anyway, fun side note. The point is that like you overestimate what you're able to do. You say, I'm gonna go hard. I'm gonna work out. I'm gonna practice musical instruments. I'm gonna learn another language. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do that. And you're feeling some kind of like energy, and you're experiencing this sort of limbo of time between Christmas and the New Year. So you're in that space where you're like, I can do anything, right? A couple weeks later, after going hard, you inevitably burn out, or you just end up having to get back to those priorities that are the most demanding. What's the most demanding priority? It's obviously always going to be work. And so this is mostly something I think that people who have jobs suffer from. But you could be a housewife who doesn't have to work, who's got a traditional bread earner spouse. She's still not going to have it, because we come out of a schooling system that turns us into a standing reserve of labor power. And so that's like, I think probably the most essential thing I want to focus on here for the next 10 minutes. And that is to say that time energy, and I'll do the symbol for it here. This is a T and that is an E. And when you write the word time energy, it is a single word, nothing like a friend or a fellow traveler who's like, yeah, blah, blah, blah. I love the concept of time energy. And they spell it with like an extra E in here, like uppercase or something. And I'm like, you haven't even looked at the title of my videos, or like, you haven't even looked at the title of the book if you're spelling it that way. Kind of crazy when people are in such a hurry to use the concept because they've heard it, but they don't even know how to write it, which is fair. That is fair. That's kind of like us, people who, maybe read for years without talking about ideas, and now you can't pronounce the words that you've been reading. You know what they mean, you just can't pronounce them. So I'm not making fun of anybody in that situation, but it is also funny. And so that's a symbol for time energy. And it comes prior to labor power, our reduction to labor power. And so labor power is not the same thing as labor, right? Famously, Friedrich Engels said that this was the most innovative concept Karl Marx had developed, because prior to him, the labor theory of value had been based on the idea of labor itself, whereas Marx says, no, it's labor power. It's your capacity to do labor that is being sold as a commodity. For the most part, most of the time, that is how it works. We're selling our labor power. It's not about the actual labor expenditure that you do, which is why you see construction crew guys standing around, which is why the barista at the coffee shop is paid even when nobody is there, right? Why? Well, it's because they are a standing reserve of labor power. And of course, anybody who's read The Question Concerning Technology by Martin Heidegger is going to know that standing reserve, Bestand in German, this is what we are all reduced to by inframing, he says. Inframing, which is, this is Heidegger's way of talking about capitalism. For the most part, he just thinks it's modernity. But the point is that the whole world is turned into a storehouse of resources. But he's keen on this. It's not just the Earth's natural resources. It's also human resources. But turning human labor power from time energy into labor power requires education. It actually requires a kind of education that is very anti-intellectual. And I'm just going to call it schooling. Now, this is not the same thing as education. I just said that it's a kind of education, but for the deschooling people, for the critical pedagogy people, this distinction is a useful one that's been around for a while. And so I'm just going to run with that, for the purpose of this conversation. Time energy doesn't just turn into labor power. It also turns into, we could talk about creative power. We could talk about a variety of other things, but the word I want to focus on here, thanks to Daniel Tutt's newest book, How to Read Like a Parasite, something about the left and Nietzsche, is this word otium. Are you all familiar with this word, otium? Basically, it means leisure time, right? Leisure time, which I believe Adorno defined as comfortable and unconstrained. Otium is comfortable and unconstrained. Well, one way of thinking about the history of society, as going with this theme of communism, a history of class struggles, is that historically, if you look back at any previous society, one of the big questions we can ask is, how was labor power organized so that a few people got to have their otium? Well, in Nietzsche, we really have to thank Daniel Tutt for making this relevant for a new generation. Nietzsche was like, yeah, the aristocracy has always only ever cared about two things, otium and bellum. These are the words, I think they're Latin, I don't know. These are the words for leisure and war. But the bellum, war, it's not just to test your courage. It's not just to test your strategic prowess. It's not just to have some fun and fuck over the neighbor. It's so that you can secure the resources so that you get to have your otium. And it is on the basis of that we get this thing that I'm a big fan of called the liberal arts, which obviously has nothing to do with liberalism because it precedes liberalism by at least 2,000 years. And I always write liberating arts because I hate the word liberal. Liberating arts. It's not commonsensical to working class people. You say liberal arts and they think of snooty little, art school kids or whatever. We're going to call them racist because they didn't say or do exactly what that kid imagines they should say or do. So I say liberating arts, which is not exactly something that most even privileged college kids today get to have. That's one of the things that you get with time energy theory is a realization that the people who are supposed to have their otium don't. The professionals and managers of capital don't. They are actually facing physical exhaustion, just like the rest of workers, but then they also face those other two kinds of exhaustion that Zizek talks about, which is, so what we have first, it's like the mundane physical exhaustion. Everyone has that. But then there's also, I'll call it care work exhaustion, right? Which, that's like the kernel of truth when a person talks about emotional labor, right? There's a kernel of truth there. And that's just that care work is real work in the sense that you're not going to have time energy if you're putting copious amounts of energy towards being present for the suffering of others and caring for them because you're like a nurse or something. Like in that case, you're still facing physical exhaustion because you're running around on your feet the whole time, but you're actually having to show up in a different way than me at Amazon. When I work at Amazon, I've got my secret earbud in there and I'm just listening to audiobooks the whole time. There's a complete disassociation between what I'm doing at this exhausting physical level and what I'm doing mentally. You can't do that in most other kinds of careers, including the ones that require creative problem solving. I don't know if I've announced this to you yet, Cadell, but I'm sure most of you haven't heard the good news yet. And that is that Slavoj Žižek actually wrote a preface for the Time Energy book. And so I'm rolling out a second edition on that here in a second. It'll be out in like a week, actually. And there's going to be a couple of new podcast interviews dropping at Sublation Media and One Dime Radio. So stay tuned on that. But basically, in that preface, Žižek talks about this distinction between these three kinds of exhaustion. And he says that Byung-Chul Han in the Burnout Society is only really focused on the exhaustion of care work and creative problem solving. He's not really thinking about this kind of mundane, physical, tedious exhaustion. And so Slavoj says, basically that I've thought about this better or whatever. It's very nice. It's very generous what he does there. He's nice and generous with everybody. Don't he's just a nice and generous guy. But no, the fact that he said this is really helpful for the whole project. So what I'm trying to say is that the professionals and managers of capital and the people who are planning on taking on those kinds of careers at some point in their future, usually students, and or people who just relate this way and think this way and try to act this way, are fucked. They don't actually have the otium to do the liberating arts, which was their sort of domain. It was supposed to be the reason that they're made of better stuff than all of us. Their pedigree, their breeding wasn't just genetic. It was supposed to be an actual, like, multi-generational accumulation of kinds of social and cultural capital based on having had otium. And so before I put this all away, I just want to also say that another word for leisure, this one is I think it's ancient Greek, it's skole. And so skole also means leisure, but it's also the root of the word school, skole. It's like that. And I'm probably not pronouncing it properly. Webster's dictionary says that's funny, or probably strikes people as a little weird, because obviously students don't experience leisure. So why is the root of school leisure, right? Well, it's because it came from free men of Athens who had secured their otium through bellum. And as a result, they had slaves, a standing reserve of labor that was organized by their wives for the most part, right? That was the original idea of economics. And so this is the basic picture here. And I want to quickly close out with just a few points of clarification. It's very important to say, in a sort of sense, nobody has time energy. In a sort of sense, nobody has it. Even if you were, let's say, laid off, if you don't have, I'll just say, potential recognition, this is supposed to be a diamond, and that's an R with a dot in the I in case anybody doesn't have eyes on screen, but it's just a symbol for potential recognition. If you don't have potential recognition, then you don't have time energy. This is how I've developed it. Why? Well, it's because of the energy factor. There are two ways of thinking about energy. There's physical energy and there's libidinal energy, right? Now, I know that last month you all did something on libidinal energy, right? Was it last month? It was, right? Yeah. Well, and I really wish I could have been there, everybody. I had a lecture at the exact same time, so that's why I wasn't able to be there. And that was heartbreaking. I really did want to be there. And the post that Cadell wrote on it is awesome. And I've kind of skimmed it, and I aim to read and reread it until I am able to sort of wrap my head around libidinal energy, which is not like, it's not easy for me. I've been trying to understand psychoanalysis now for 4 years. It's not easy for me. Nothing about psychoanalysis comes easily. And not only is a lot of it counterintuitive, but also a lot of it seems suspicious to me. My issue with it is that it just, why? Like the big, why do you think that? Why does Freud think that? Why does Lacan think that? Why isn't it this other way? What are these alternative ways that it could be? You know, just like the basic hysteric kinds of questions that one's going to have. Anyway.
I just want to say quickly, it's rubbed off on you because you're using Lacanian math themes in your work. You know, you've got these you're coming up with your own algebra there.
Yeah. I know it's true. And well, and I do like to use, knockoff brand symbolic logic. Like this is from modal logic, right? The diamond as possibility, which I'm also using as potential. That is like the tilde as not, and the diamond, those are already in modal logic. But yes, time energy and recognition, you're right. And so physical energy and libidinal energy, the reason that we have this distinction is because a person can be completely healthy, completely rested, everything physically in order, but unable to get out of bed because they are so depressed, right? They might want to off themselves even though they're technically, physically healthy. So that's intuitive, but these things also seem related, right? Because health and fitness, exercise, those kinds of things, like a good diet, ultimately seem to have some kind of a relationship to libidinal energy. But then we also have to, when we're thinking about libidinal energy, we have to think about libidinal economics, the most important parts of which I take to be desire and drive. And in my book, I just say desire drive economy because I'm trying to write this to an audience of people who aren't going to understand everything. And so I didn't want to use libidinal energy because I didn't want to have to write a paragraph about what is sex, right? A course that we just did together last year. I'm not there yet, right? Like I'm not at that point where I'm able to write about it with good conscience, right? I'm too divided up on these other areas of the theory, which I'm about to get into. But anyway, desire drive, the tension between desire and drive. You want to be this egoically. You have this idea of who you want to be. You are a pleasure seeking or pleasure principle directed kind of person. But of course, then drive comes in and messes that up. And you overeat and you binge things and you road rage and you all of these things that get in the way of like the pleasure principle, right? Well, it is a tension between those two things that can often give or undermine energy. So there's something interesting here that has to be worked on. And I don't have the capability of doing the work for this. So I'm really excited to see what you all might come up with. I'm really excited to see what Michael Downs is doing in the background. Mikey over at the Dangerous Maybe blog. I know he's doing a lot with energy and with time energy. He's been really big and supportive for this concept because it means everything to him for a while now. Before the concept was a concept, we were talking about the politics of time. It's just that energy became the most important factor for me because I was finding ways of hacking more time in my week, but I was finding I didn't have energy during that time because I was still exhausted, right? So like the most important piece of the puzzle is that energy without time is restless, unharnessed, erratic, not very reliable kinds of energy. And time without energy is exhausted time, is garbage time, right? Yeah. So I'm just going to do this. There are three main methods and or theoretical approaches to time energy theory. And then I'll say what the aim is, or maybe I'll state it as a question and we'll just go to Q&A at that point. But the first, obviously the last of these is psychoanalysis. So psychoanalysis is super important for understanding time energy, but it's probably the least developed in all of my work. Okay. The first is existential, phenomenological, and then structural. And I have to add that even though it's maybe confusing for people because most people, when they think of structural, they're like thinking like a literary critic and they're thinking, oh, we're talking about Saussure and Levi-Strauss. You know, fair enough. They are structural in their approach. But the thing is there are existential thinkers like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. They are not structural, right? There are phenomenologists like Husserl. He is not existential. It is Heidegger who approaches the existential phenomenological questions in a structural way. I think that's very important. It's useful. I haven't gotten into Heidegger a lot, but he's been a big deal for me. And the way that existential phenomenological structural perspective weighs in on time energy is just to say that existential time, and I'll just say /human time, is not capitalist /techno time, which is also the time of physics, which is valid, which is helpful, which is a certain way of thinking about things, but currently it dominates everything. And the clock counting down fixed hours to the second is not normal. It's normal for us, but it's not a normal thing for humans. I'm not saying that that means that the natural kind of time is therefore superior in every way and that this is, evil fallen time. I'm not saying that, but existential time lives in variable hours, variable periods. This is how time was marked historically in all societies prior to the invention of the clock, is variable time. Lunchtime was a longer hour than your regular work time. That's true. There were also like special hours that were meant for worship. There was certain days that were set aside for worship. The difference between existential human time and techno time comes down to cyclical time versus linear time. Linear time is where you get Byung-Chul Han talking about point time, which he actually just gets from chapter 6 of Division 2 of Being in Time, which is where Heidegger gets into time reckoning and the ordinary conception of time. He has at that point deconstructed the concept of ordinary time, but then he's getting into the nitty gritty with it in chapter 6 of Division 2. Also in chapter 5, that's where you get into the ways in which time, real time, historicality, he calls it, is a time with others, and it's a time that has a past with others, which is to say a heritage, which he thinks is the basis of destiny, which is obviously problematic given his politics a few years later. But there's something to it. There is obviously something to it. What is the thing that there is to it? I would just call it cyclical time as the basis of repeatability with others. Cyclical time as the basis for ritual itself. Outside of all the words we use in religious or political or even sporting events, it's the fact that you're doing something in a repeatable way with other people. That matters. But obviously there's institutions that assume nobody has time energy and people might just show up sometimes. And those mega churches or those political parties, they just assume that you don't have time energy. And then they still find a way of institutionalizing certain results, but they're not operating in the kind of cyclical time that we're thinking of. Of course, you could say, oh, capital, it works within this year cycle. And, there's ways in which capitalist time can't get outside of cyclical time. But how do we experience this time? We experience time today in a purely atomized way. This is why we say, it's my Friday this Tuesday. It's my Saturday this Friday. Like, what does that mean? It means we're using a metaphor from back when everybody shared a weekend. Now I've individualized it for my own self. Okay. But, as somebody pointed out recently, my Spanish language tutor, Carl, said, the moment you're saying my Friday or my Saturday, you're doing the boss's work for him. Do not do that. If it's not a day that you have off with everyone else, you've been fucked. Don't, you can make the most of it, but don't rationalize it. And finally, the last thing that I'll say is the one that I think I already did enough on, which is, so the first, existential phenomenological structural, the third, psychoanalytic, and the second is CPE, or critique of political economy, which is obviously Karl Marx, Das Kapital, and the expansion packs on that project. So critique of political economy. It is actually in the field of CPE that we do find people talking about this critique of capitalist time as abstract time, right? It's something that's determined by socially necessary labor time, which is taken to be either the or a determinant of value. So I'll just close out by saying, for the sort of conversation period, the real question then is like, what's the aim of this concept? What is the purpose of this concept? There's short-term and long-term aims, and I'm curious what you all think those might be. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dave. I mean, this is really, I'm going to take this as sort of like the model for what I'd like Thought Lab to be. So like, I just want to sort of commend you for sort of what you've offered here, because this is how I imagine Thought Lab. This is a space where we get sort of like a really well-defined overview of a concept, and I actually think this is perfectly situated for the month, really, because with my opening presentation on communism, really what I was focusing on was the importance of the structure of lack and drive in relationship to the structure of utopian desire as it relates to the history of both religious and secular sort of teleological aims, which end in nightmares, or that's at least sort of like what I've been, trying to think through myself. And then we also had an edge event on hyperhumanism last week, which was largely focused on trying to get us to focus on shifting ourselves away from putting technology as an end in itself, in terms of a transhumanist vision, and focusing more on, let's say, the existential and phenomenological negativities of being human. But I mean, I do have some questions myself. Maybe we could have a little bit of a discussion before opening it up for a Q&A. I have a specific question about otium, and of course, there's sort of a temptation to play with, like, Marx is the opium of the masses and stuff like that. Do we need otium for the masses? What I was thinking about was
Hold
go for it.
Hold on. I don't think anyone's ever said that, so don't downplay it. That's amazing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did I just get a vapor there? All
yeah,
right.
No, congratulations. That was awesome.
You're doing well when you get air horns.
Yeah.
So no,
Yeah.
So here's a thought experiment for you. When I was in my doctorate, I think I had a real privilege Let's say that. I had a real privilege because I was given a space that I would call a space of otium. And what I mean by that is I had 4 years of funding to like I had to produce a doctorate in 4 years. I had to produce a research project in 4 years, but I had 4 years of funding where basically there was no overall or overarching determination or directive on terms of what my thesis would become. It was just sort of an open 4 year space. Here's the grant. There you go. Now, what's the difference between it's a nice space. It was a nice space to be in. Now I had to make myself uncomfortable, and I had to constrain myself in order to produce the thesis. Right? I mean, I couldn't just sit around and do nothing for 4 years, and because at the end of the day, then I would have gotten nowhere. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, if we lived in a situation structurally where people had otium, what are the mechanisms or what are the policies or what are the ideas you have or developed that would increase the possibility that people, let's say, self-constrain towards a sort of positive aim as opposed to just doing opium with their otium time?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think
Because
this
I
is
worked
actually,
hard, right? I had my otium, but I worked hard too, and I think it's getting this right, right? Like, we don't want an external control on our time energy, but it's kind of like learning how to build up our own personal relationship to time energy. That's how I'm thinking about it.
there's a very naive leftist response that has something to it, which would just be that, oh, actually, you never, the naive response is just to say, well, this is within capitalism, so people just don't have the imagination. They don't really know what to do with their time energy because they don't, it's all been turned into labor power. But so people right now, when they have time freed up, they just play video games
Yeah.
and they go jack off and eat ice cream or
Yeah.
whatever, which is, fair
How do
enough
we
because
set?
people are,
I mean, so like
okay.
just on that point, like a lot of the things that you'll get complaints in men's work is that there's this. Actually, I kind of proposed it with the manifesto when I was working with them. Is this dark triad of jerking off, playing video games, drinking, or doing drugs?
Yeah.
Like how
Do
do
you
how do you
see it?
take that and sublimate it basically?
Yeah. And so this is where I'll say, I'll preface the what I take to be like the better answer as opposed to that naive one. After really quick, one of my favorite things about that Adorno free time essay is that he uses this word recreation, because the essay is called free time, and he's talking about the way that free time is not free time. It's not actually free at all. It's not autonomous because it's not unconstrained, and it's not comfortable because it is in reference to the clock. And so as long as it's in reference to the clock, it's not really leisure, which would be otium, right? Well, he talks about the recreational industry and how ironic that is. The idea that people are obligated now to go recreate their energy. Now, he doesn't call it energy. He's not talking about it that way, but he does talk about the need to rest. And so what is recreation? Recreation of? It is recreation of, it is recreation of your capacity to go back to work, of labor power. And so video gaming is actually good for that. Camping is actually good for that. Camping is probably a million times better for you than video gaming. There's a lot of research that is talking about like 15 minutes in the woods per day can actually do all of these like positive health, effects on you and stuff like that. I don't think you get those same positive health effects from video gaming. Now, I'm not against video gaming, but it is intuitive to think, well, wouldn't people just play video games in that future? And then there's another naive response, which is also valid to some extent. And that is just like, well, it's not freedom if you can't just play video games, right? But let's give the devil his due. Most people don't love themselves when all they've done is play video games, jack off, and eat ice cream. They actually hate it. So
Yeah.
what this is where, I talk about in the first couple of chapters in Time Energy, a father in my life who said that after he makes his first million, he's going to invest that and then he'll cash in on the dividends and retire for the rest of his life, right? Like that was his vision so that he could be a good father. And a few years later, after he'd been quite successful, I was talking to him and he said that he will never retire. And I said, well, why won't you retire? And he said, because I'll just play video games and I don't want my kids to see me like that. That's admirable at a certain level. but obviously it comes from a lack of imagination. Now, the arrow pointing up to time energy here with the tilde in front of it, the tilde means negation of time energy. What causes the negation of time energy outside of our reduction to labor power? Well, one of the things is not having potential recognition. Potential recognition. Now, there's a way of talking about recognition that I don't like, which is just like, oh, we are completely driven by the need for a high five or affirmation from someone else. That is not what I'm getting at. I'm getting at that if I've put in so much effort into doing pull-ups or reading Being in Time, in either of those situations, it doesn't really mean anything if someone else doesn't get it. If they're not able to kind of go, oh, I've tried to do pull-ups. Those are hard. You just did X amount. That's impressive, right? Like that requires other people having tried it themselves. So you can be a violin virtuoso, but if people don't know music, you can only really play basic songs and they'll appreciate you for basic songs. But if they've all tried music for their whole lives because it's just a part of the culture, and then you fucking tear it up and you do something impressive, then people are like, oh, I get what you just did there. That's amazing. This ability to sort of like understand what you've accomplished is kind of what I'm saying is recognition in this specific usage. And so that is what's undermined. When other people don't have time energy, you don't have time energy because they're not able to appreciate what you've done, right? Now, with
that's really
pull-ups, it's
important.
objective. With sporting events, it's thank you. Yeah, with sporting events, it's objective, like or you know, intersubjective, we could say, but it's obvious. It's like that guy's clearly better than everyone else. Like this guy's running circles around everybody else. That's obvious. And
it's harder in academic life, though.
Yeah, this is exactly harder in academic life. First, because academic life can be simulatory. It's a lot easier to simulate. It's a lot easier to kind of make it seem like you've done something because you have a lot of articles published that didn't really say anything but cited a lot of works. That makes it seem like you read a lot, right? Doesn't really mean you tarried with those texts. Doesn't really mean you tarried with those issues, right? This dynamic where potential recognition is essential for the energy being infused in a cool, calm, and collected way throughout those days. It means that there's reliable others who are also doing the thing, doing the work for that thing. So if you're going rogue and you're just doing it alone, like, you know, reading theory on your own, you might meet somebody who's into big ideas, but if they haven't been through similar territory, it's going to be hard for you to kind of check your own knowledge, and you'll feel like kind of just bullshitting your way through those conversations because they can't actually, is that what he's saying there? Is that what he's saying? Because I took that to be this. And then you have like these conversations about interpretation, and then there might be these moments of recognition where you're like, yep. Well, those are rewarding. Those are special. Most people don't have access to those. Instead, most people, when it comes to potential recognition, it's like, you know, how many people can you have sex with? How many keg stands have you done in your life? What parties do you get invited to? What kind of music do you listen to? What kind of consumer goods are you into, right? And so people are not exposed, like Winston Churchill was in his childhood, to a wide array of different ways of using one's OTM, a wide array of different kinds of challenges that one can tackle, right? And so anyway, the answer, the simple answer is we need transitional institutions like Theory Underground and Philosophy Portal. So transitional institutions means institutions that show people, did I even spell that right? Anyway, transitional institutions that bring the skole back to school, which means that it's not for a career, it's for a way of life. So school in its proper sense. Boom. With transitional institutions that use time energy, people will be inspired. They'll go, look at what those people are able to do. They're not just playing video games, right? And my short solution for that is to do what Catherine Liu says and abolish liberal arts colleges. Now, that's all she proposes. I go a step further and I say, don't just abolish the liberal arts colleges, move those professors to libraries where they will then they'll have their OTM. They will be able to help people look through the books at the library. They'll kind of be there to help people.
I like this idea you have. I like this idea
and they'll do public monthly seminar, you know, just
yeah,
like what you're doing.
I heard you talking about this recently.
Yeah, just imagine if Cadell was paid full time to do what he's doing right now. but just exactly what you're doing right now. Instead of having librarians, we have us doing what we're doing here.
Oh, I mean, it's a really interesting idea, because libraries have this sort of, stereo. I mean, and it's also like brings up this weird dimension of the physical and the virtual, but libraries do have, I mean, I do think we need to bring what we're doing to the physical in new ways. And I think you're pioneering that as well. And it's interesting because when we usually think about libraries, we think about boring, dead places. But I think the idea of making libraries a space where you can have really cool, innovative lectures and meet interesting professors is a fantastic idea, and try to bring these places to life. A lot to think through there, and I really do like your emphasis on the potential recognition. I'm trying to think through how it applies to both my experience in the doctorate, how that helped or hindered me, and also sort of what I've been trying to do online. So the first thing that's coming to my mind from online is I want to put a self critique on myself first. That when I published my books, I thought that there was going to be more recognition for them than there was. Now, part of the issue is that I don't think that there was a space for that potential recognition in place. One of the consequences, in precisely the way you're describing it, meaning if there's nobody around that can recognize them, then you're just going to sort of fall into a void there. Now,
Right.
in terms of negating that and trying to sublate that, one of the things I've tried to do with the philosophical conversation series is I've tried to design it in such a way that it's responding to that need, meaning that if someone online in our circles publishes a good work, or like I can tell, oh, that took a long time to do that, right? Like that must have taken you 2 years to do that. Or no, or just like, for example, inviting you here to do a lecture on time energy. I'm like, well, you've been working on that concept for a long time, right? So that deserves recognition. Like this idea of the potential recognition to me is very crucial for building, meaning that, and I think it's really important that we have that constraint of potential recognition, because basically on the internet, you can talk to a million people. So how do you constrain that? How do you focus that energy? And I think potential recognition is a good one. Is like if you've been through something, and then you can do that as well. So like if you've been through something, like you've written a difficult text, or you've built a difficult course, or you've been built a difficult online plot, you know how difficult it is. So that makes it so
Exactly.
then it makes it easy for you to identify people who have put in that work, right? Whereas I think one of the problems in the contemporary institutions is that a lot of them aren't actually putting in difficult work. So because they haven't put in difficult work, they don't know how to recognize difficult work. And so it's this very vicious cycle which eats itself into the ground, because the people who are doing really difficult work don't get recognized for it, and the people and no one on the outside can tell the difference between difficult work and not difficult work. I hope that makes sense. There's a
No,
few
that is exactly it. That's exactly it. Yeah. No, you've nailed it. This is essential. And that the thing is that recognition can be easily simulated. It can be easily simulated where you lower the standards at the university, you hold everyone's hand, you walk them through the process, you pat them on their little square hat, and you say, here's a degree. That's recognition, right? Obviously, it's not. It's not fucking recognition. Now, of course, if you worked your ass off and you don't think structurally, then you're in that experience and you still feel everything, because the actual hard work you're doing matches this symbolic recognition. And so there's some kind of like oh yes, pride. But there's also kind of like, no, I've been through the process and now I've done the thing and I don't really feel anything. It's just maybe you feel happy because you put up with a bunch of bullshit and you dealt with a bunch of bureaucratic acrobatics and red tape, and you're able to make it, and now your parents are proud of you. So you still feel some pride, but is it the kind of recognition we're talking about? No, it's not. Video games also provide a simulation of that kind of recognition. Oh, you speed ran Minecraft in X amount of hours? Because they've done similar things, they get it. So it's like it's easier to simulate the kind of recognition we're talking about in these domains than it is in any other, really.
There's a few things that I wanted to ask you. I also want to I mean, we've got a lot of time, so it's okay. Maybe I'll ask one more thing and then we'll open it up for a larger Q&A, because I'm really excited to see what the collective intelligence here is going to throw at you. Okay, so I'm gonna sort of pick and choose sort of what I really want to
Cool.
emphasize or not. I'm debating between the time energy reductionist angle and sort of trying to make an analogy to Einstein's space time. Because it's like, because Einstein kind of revolutionized physics in just like, and revolutions and things, revolutions and things only take a minor distinction tweak. Like so many people were wrestling with big worldviews and paradigms, and Einstein was just like, well, what if we kind of rethink the way space and time are working in Newton and actually view them as, view time as another dimension of space? And then how does that change the entire paradigm? And that changed all of physics. I'm just wondering if, and it's interesting the way you tell the story of time energy. I think it's important that you told your story. I think it was when you were working. Would you consider yourself a Bernie bro at the time? I know you were working on the Bernie
Yeah,
campaign.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
Well, I mean,
working
obviously
there,
not in the actual pejorative sense that has
no.
been put, because that is it's a stigmatized term that was actually weaponized against the movement that was not primarily men, but also men are usually people who end up speaking at things because we're obsessives and we go hard. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
sure. I was a Bernie bro.
I'll
Yeah.
combine the two questions with the Einstein space-time and the time energy reductionist angles, because like when you bring the time energy together, not just mashing them together, but thinking about it in the precise way that you're trying to think about it, do you imagine that as a political paradigm, that concept functioning as, let's say, a political economic paradigm, could have the sort of same effects on our political economic field that, say, that minor distinction in physics had a total field, it was a total field change? Like that's what I'm trying to get at. Does time energy change the entire political economic field in your mind? And that's, I guess, related to the reductionist angle, because this is independent of whether or not you're thinking in a religious, spiritual, political, economic dimension, or left or right or anything like that. Like it's kind of like more a fundamental concept, which then changes the way we might be able to think about, let's say, religion and politics.
I mean, that's why I'm a time energy reductionist, is because I do think so. Yeah. Maybe the only way to really revolutionize a field is to take time and then hyphen and then add something, and then that's the magic recipe. So that's what no, I'm just kidding. But I think that one of the ways that it actually revolutionizes the field is it allows us to read philosophers and ask, how is time and or energy operative for this thinker? Now, if you read Descartes, he sells people on the vision of modern science and mathematics. He sells people on the vision. He had to sell us. Why did he have to sell us? People were, superstitious about science. People were skeptical about science. They wanted the church to rein it in, right? So he wrote, and after the Galileo's, was it the? It's not called an Inquisition. What's it called? I'm forgetting, but whatever. After they canceled Galileo and made him recant, Descartes was afraid to publish his meditations, so he didn't publish them. And he was like, "What am I supposed to do?" So he wrote the Discourse on Method and published that anonymously, and it was circulated widely. It was written in the popular tongue. Well, why? Why did he do this? He was trying to sell people on the idea that, hey guys, science and technology are not the enemy. Actually, science and technology can be labor-saving devices. So he sold people on this idea that technology would be able to be a labor-saving device. So people have to be sold on ideas. You can't just change things from the top down without kind of consent of the governed. People have to be sold on the idea of science and technology. Well, people also have to be sold on the idea of what they would do with time energy. And then with the concept of time energy, they're going to realize that more time in the week is not enough, which has been traditionally in labor struggles. The actual focus is more, higher wages or more time. But nobody's thinking, oh yeah, but more time for what? Where are the institutions for doing things outside of and or beyond the profit motive? And so the reason this is revolutionary, I think, for how we think about political philosophy as well, is that, going back to the question of the aim and or purpose of time energy, which you're kind of getting at with this question, if you're already anti-capitalist, it's very easy to just go, well, capitalism is the reason nobody has their time energy. So then socialism would be the reason we would have our time energy. Now, like, you could be a reform socialist who uses the concept of time energy. Maybe you could, as a reform socialist, put serious influence or pressure on the existing movement and or organizations. That would be fantastic if you could actually cause that sort of paradigm shift. But I'm skeptical of being able to change people's minds. I'm skeptical about being able to change the minds of activists, especially. I have not found activist types to be the most contemplative, reflective, and or critical of their own assumptions types. And so, I mean, let's be honest, there is a hatred of theory in activist spaces, right? So that just makes me question whether there can be reform within the existing movements or parties. And here's why. Everybody looks back to Lenin. And Lenin said in Left-Wing Childishness, an infantile disorder, he said, socialism is inconceivable without large-scale capitalist engineering based on the latest discoveries of modern science. It is inconceivable without planned state organization which keeps tens of millions of people to the strictest observance of a unified standard in production and distribution. We Marxists have always spoken of this, and it is not worthwhile wasting 2 seconds talking to people who do not understand even this. And then he says anarchists and a good half of the left socialist revolutionaries. All right. I'm not a simp for Lenin, but I am sympathetic. And so I know where he's coming from. When he says this, he's in a very specific historical period. They had to develop the country. They had inside and outside enemies trying to undermine the movement. And of course, they needed workers to work. But the reason I read this here is because anybody who's an orthodox Marxist is a Marxist-Leninist. A Trotskyist or a Stalinist is a Marxist-Leninist. A Maoist is largely based on some kind of, it's influenced by Marxist-Leninism more than it's influenced by just actual Marx and what he thought and did. So this sort of fidelity to the idea of socialism kind of holds Lenin up here. And then because there's this sort of like, oh yeah, he had it figured out, we just need to do that instead of this social democracy thing. We just needed to be Bolsheviks. I'm worried that this kind of idea would be enshrined in any kind of movement that harkens back in that way. Now, if somebody can reform the movement to center time energy and to make that a correction on this, then fantastic. But yeah, maybe we need, what did he say? Tens of millions of people to the strictest observance of unified standard of production and distribution. Sure, there's a way of expanding that where we say, abolish bullshit jobs, use automation to eliminate the shittiest jobs, and then redistribute everything else that cannot be eliminated. And then people only have to do 20,000 hours of work in their lifetime, and they can figure out if they want to do it all at once in a binged way, or if they want to space that out over time. There we go. Solution. That solution comes from Andre Gors and all of the work that he did, but he was a post-Marxist for a reason. And that is because the Marxists of his time, and let's be honest, the Marxists of our time, do not center the politics of time. Thanks. I'm glad, without your question, I wouldn't have brought that up. And it was something that I really wanted to address in the lecture. So thank you.
Again, there's a lot of things I'd like to say, specifically that program of abolishing bullshit jobs, use automation, and redistribute the rest of the jobs. I'd imagine a lot of them are going to have to be. Anyway, I could go on that for a long time, but I'm going to open it up to questions. We've got Demitri and then David, and then so we'll have a lot of time. I'll probably be able to jump in again before the end of this. Demitri, you want to jump in? Just unmute yourself first. This video was a condensed clip from Thought Lab, one of the 4 Philosophy Portal live event spaces. To watch the whole video, or to attend and participate in future events, visit philosophyportal.online and become a member today. Starting in 2024, Philosophy Portal opened The Portal, a live event space dedicated to making philosophy actual. Every month we host 4 events organized under a common theme, designed to build different discursive spaces, to learn concepts, explore the edge of thinking, learn from thought leaders, and get personal about our intellectual journeys. Members get access to a living thinking community and access to the entire history of events, as well as discounts on recorded and future courses. Couples are very much encouraged and get a 2-for-1 discount. To learn more, visit philosophyportal.online and consider becoming a member today. The Portal, the work of the concept.